Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's 3:09. It's my pleasure to introduce Conrad, who's going to talk to us about lessons launching dozens of new languages in a new UI. So let's round of applause for Conrad. Take it away.
This is exciting. I was reminiscing that I worked at Google 9 years ago. 10 plus. I'm really happy to give a talk today. Now, of course, I work at Meta, which supports Facebook, supports Instagram and WhatsApp, many other applications. And while I get the chance to present, all of this work was contributed by an entire team of people. So I really want to, before I even go into any of the details, so thank you to all my team who is here today, all of my team that is back in the office still working. And I also want to thank the people for organizing this conference. I've been basically like refreshing the Unicode events page. I'm like, oh, when is there going to be an in-person conference again? So thank you so much for letting us chat. All right, so in the agenda, there's be 3 sections in this talk. First, to talk about the recent languages that we've launched and some of the work going into that. And then I'll talk generally like what are the strategies that we used in order to make sure we could scale our system to support these languages. And then I'll go through some lessons about using CLDR and the ways that we CLDR both is great for us, but also maybe there's a few rough edges that we can work together to improve. So let's first talk about Meta's recent launches. So to kind of level set, Meta is a company that, while social media is the core of it, we really build many different apps, and the core business goal is to help people connect, find communities, and grow their businesses themselves. We support dozens of applications, some of them having millions of users, some of them having billions of users, which is always kind of mind-boggling because if I'll make a change, suddenly a billion people can be affected, which is both a blessing and a curse. And we have to translate the user interface for people across the world. And it's more than just translation, of course. While I use the word translation as a shorthand, localization involves many steps beyond just the words. We support many different applications. You've probably seen most of these icons for the various different apps. And we have to make sure that our central internationalization team can make sure that each one of these apps is able to provide the correct local content. And we have to do this across many different platforms. It's an oversimplification to say only iOS, Windows, and Android, because there's many different platforms in which we have to build our apps on. We have to make sure that we're not just supporting Java, that we're supporting Kotlin. That people's strings aren't just coming from the device, but are also coming from our server. And so it really multiplies the complexity in providing the localized content to end users. And then lastly, what kind of content? We can be showing that users are posting and sharing content that they wrote themselves. People are sharing videos with each other, and the languages that they're presenting in videos, of course, may be completely different than the languages that they're writing down. And then, of course, we're presenting a lot of strings in the interface. For this talk, I'll focus just on the languages that we're supporting on Facebook, both the main Facebook app and also Facebook Lite, which, as mentioned previously, it's our Facebook app for not only third world countries. The idea is that we want, if you don't have a great internet connection, if you don't have a device that has enough memory, FB Lite can be a good way for people in emerging markets in order to also use the Facebook platform. And I'll be focusing on those 2 Android apps, and I'll be focused on the interface strings. I think there's a lot of interesting things to learn about the languages people share and post in videos, but we'll be focusing on the interface. So over the past 3 years, we've launched support for over 35 languages. Some of these were completely brand new languages that we didn't support before. Some of these were languages that maybe we supported by the community translation program that we used to have, that we've now upgraded to professional support. And this brings the total amount of languages that you can use for the user interface for Facebook to over 110. So some examples that you can see from this map. So one of the first languages we did in this effort was Oromo in Ethiopia for Facebook Lite. We've added Kazakh, we've added Haitian Creole, we've added Javanese, and right now we're we're in the process of even adding more today, and so this number changes every day, which is pretty exciting for me. One example of a language that we've really enjoyed launching. I mean, we enjoy every single one of them. Was Haitian Creole. We worked with a number of linguists from Haiti in order to onboard their language, and they really appreciated the process that we did with them. So just to kind of back up a little bit. So Haitian Creole is the main language that people talk about with their family and their friends in Haiti. It's a shared official language with French, but French is usually considered like the business language, but the language that you're actually talking about, and when you're talking with people that you know, then you're familiar with, is Haitian Creole. However, Haitian Creole isn't supported by virtually any platform right now. It's not a selectable option, and part of that's because it is known as a Creole language, and there's a continuum of languages where you have pidgins, you have Creoles, and then you have like formalized languages, and usually a lot of times in tech we avoid supporting the pidgins because pidgins don't have standardized dictionaries. They may not even have standardized orthographies, whereas Creoles are pidgins that have kind of formed and solidified, and there's a lot more conventions, but is it a mature language? And for us looking at Haitian Creole, of course it's a mature language. There's a lot of standardization that they're working on doing in Haiti, but us sitting in the west coast of the United States, we're not necessarily seeing this work happening and realizing that like Haitian Creole is ready to be recognized as just like any other language. So our linguists were very passionate and very happy that we worked with them in order to onboard their language to Facebook. So how did we launch 35 new languages? I'm so happy that I'm coming two sessions after someone talking about how they got to 28 languages. Now, how do we go to 110? Oh, it's crazy. So there's a lot of strategies that involve not actually doing the work. And so this is kind of like for all you emergent PMs, but even not just PMs, for engineers as well, and everyone across roles, is in order to scale to these many languages, we needed to make sure we had the right documentation, that we used protocols in order to launch these languages, that we built the right tools, and that we utilized automation to make us go even faster. Of course, none of these steps are actually doing the work. Because ultimately what we want to do, we want to provide localized content. But if we do these four things first, then it will be much easier to actually do the work, and we'll do it sustainable and actually keep a good bar of quality for our support for end users. So let's first talk about documentation. So the screenshot that I'm showing here is a little bit modified from what it actually was, but this was my favorite document that we had. It was a Google Drive spreadsheet where we just had this timeline for every single individual language that we were supporting, and for every single week, what that language support was going to look like. So the key thing to think about here is that we are a giant cross-functional team. While my role as an engineer, I'm working with data analysts that are working on motivating what languages we support and analyzing the experiments that we have. We have the vendor managers that are making sure that we're connecting with the right linguist in order to do the translations. We have people doing the localization testing. And so in order to make sure that, like, how do we launch every single language, and where you need to plug in, like, do you need to be working with a vendor right now? Do you need to be testing the language right now? Having a master spreadsheet like this was incredibly useful. And kudos to my TPM, who just loves spreadsheets so much and got this together. Other forms of documentation that we found were essential in order to make sure that we could launch languages was one of it was composing playbooks. In 2021, there were some playbooks that said this is how you launch a language, but they were woefully unupdated because we hadn't gone through a big effort and launched a bunch. And so we learned that there was a lot of things that had changed, and we wanted to make sure that we knew exactly what the step-by-step process was. I'll show you a screenshot later of that. And also making sure the playbooks tell you who's responsible for each step. Is it an engineer that should be doing this right now? Or is it a linguist? Is it one of the project managers? And so that's really important to clarify what are we doing and who needs to do it. And also just, I love the Wikipedia inception of organization, where everything can be a link. And and it was so useful because we've already had a document, and making sure we can link out to the document or link out to the code where we need to make the configuration change saves you from trying to find it yourself. And then lastly, one of the most important documents was a spreadsheet showing links to every single configuration. So in our company, we have a different tool that where we analyze results of an experiment. We have a tool that says this is how we're rolling out. Like, this was what percent of the public can see the language today, and we have other tools to say, like, these are the numbers. This is how we're rendering numbers, and these tools are not connected to each other. They're separate, and having one spreadsheet where we can see, like, oh, these are links to all the different configurations that we need to modify in order to make a language. Made it so we didn't drop the ball. We didn't forget. We didn't just leave a language at 5% public and move on. But we were able to make sure we were able to deliver on all of them. Some principles to think about in documentation. So one of my favorite phrases is actionable insights. It's one thing to write something down, but if it doesn't mean it, if it's not something meaningful, if it doesn't change what someone does, then it's kind of fluff. And so making sure the documentation is focused on actionable information, put that first. Have a TLDR at the beginning of all of your documentation that says, this is what you get from it, this is what you need to do. I hope this presentation itself provides you some actionable insights. And I'm not just saying these things just because I find them interesting, as fun as that is. Making sure documentation is discoverable is really important. So documentation linking other documentation is a big part of that, but also cross-posting. So in our office, we use many different ways to communicate to each other. We have chats, we have our internal wikis, we have our own, like, Google Drive folders with lots of documents that you can't find. Like, searching in Google Drive is so difficult because everyone use different keywords and folder organizations. And so cross-posting your documents is really effective. So you can make sure you find this information out. Like, one good example here is sometimes, like, there'll be a language that exists in our system and no one knows who added it, but it's in our system. And it's like, wait, like, why is it there? And making sure that we have the documentation means that you can discover the reason why, and so we don't have to reconstruct the past. Like, I've been in internationalization at Meta in the past 4 years, but Meta's been going strong for almost 20, and so there's a lot of history there that I wasn't there for, and so I want to make sure that the people that come after me can learn from what I know, and I'm not just like trying to I'm not just an archaeologist trying to figure out, wait, why are we here? And then the last principle of documentation is don't repeat yourself. If you already, I sometimes see people that just, all they do is write documents, and they complain about how much documents they're writing. And I'm telling you to write all the documents, and that's crazy. But if you've already written the document, if you've already given the presentation, if you give the presentation again, just reuse the slides. Mind you, this I didn't get a chance to do that. This is a presentation from scratch, but I'll definitely be reusing it and link out to the old documentation, because there's no use in you just rewriting what you've already done. If you're trapped in documentation, you won't get the actual interesting work that you want to do. The next strategy is protocol. So I use the word protocol because way back before I even worked at Meta, I worked at a hospital. And if we got something wrong, it was the consequences weren't quite the same, like internet scale consequences, but for the individuals that we were servicing in the hospital was a lot worse. And so we needed to make sure that we developed a protocol and make sure that we followed it. And if we missed something, then it could lead to sweeping consequences. And so in localization, if you miss something, like if you get the wrong, if you use the wrong script for a language, then you can translate everything, and it's really like, oh no, the script is wrong. And so getting that right in the beginning is really important. And so by making sure that we have a written protocol for what we're doing is really important. So this is a somewhat mocked screenshot of our checklist when we're onboarding a new language into our system, and kind of the different steps that we have to do when we're starting the process to make sure that we're supporting that we're adding the language to every configuration file that it needs to be in. One thing that you'll also see here that I'll mention again later is I intentionally wrote tests that will fail once the configuration has changed, just to make sure that we know exactly what happened and that the test alerts us that a configuration change has happened. Maybe that was intentional, maybe it wasn't intentional. And so by having tests in there, it's also really helpful to be defensive, to make sure you're not accidentally releasing a language early, for instance. Other things about protocol, again, this is kind of like the interface of documentation and protocol, but some things aren't even written down. Some things are a buddy system. So making sure that you are not the one sole person in charge of launching languages or in charge of your thing. Like, I'm not the only engineer that can do this. If I were to decide to, if I wanted to go on vacation, I could. And one of my colleagues could help provide the support in order to continue launching a language. And so part of that's having documentation, but also just making sure that people that you've shared responsibilities and shared that knowledge, and so you don't have bottlenecks, and so then you can still execute on a good timeline. Another part of this is making fundamental decisions. So as I alluded to, decide early, what's the writing system that you're working on? What is the dialect you're focusing on? While it'd be nice if there was just one language and it was that simple, that's not the case for many languages. And if you choose one dialect, then you're going to disadvantage all of the other people that speak different dialects. And so you have to find the right one. For instance, our Spanish translations. We have Spanish Castellano for Spain, and we have Spanish for Latin America. Latin American Spanish is not a real dialect, but that's something that we had to choose in order to make sure that we can serve the wide population without having to just having all these duplicate translations. And so making that decision early, making sure it's clear when you're working with linguists that they're not just translating Mexican Spanish, and they're not translating Argentine Spanish, and then suddenly Spanish has all these dialects in it, depending on what linguist translated what string, but rather we have an understood dialect strategy. I'll make a plug-in for, so I love the phrase canonical everything. One of our VPs, Naomi Gelt, in order to get as far as she did, she needed to make canonical decisions and document them and live by them. And so I recommend making sure you make those canonical decisions and stick with them. Because sometimes, like, we know we don't know everything. Like, I speak English, I try to speak Italian, and I can kind of read a few other languages, but I'm supporting 35 new languages that I can't tell you if it's actually a correct translation or not. And so having the right people making decisions is really important. And so making sure that you're making these decisions and not just making assumptions, but also you're not too worried about making these decisions themselves. Because then you're just never going to actually translate something if you don't know what dialect you're going to choose. And another part of this is having a risk assessment. So we didn't expect to succeed in every single language. The original number for how many languages we planned to launch was not 35. But we knew that each language, some of them had conditions that were out of our hands, and that we wanted to get to as many languages that we can. If we get there, we'll be really happy, but we may not. Sometimes the risk is just on the timeline, and so it's just so the other people know, like, oh, maybe this won't be ready yet, and so you have to be flexible. But some of it's also like, is this language even going to make it this far? And it really helps in order to make that early, to enumerate the risks and to identify the mitigations, and so you have a much a clearer picture when inevitably these problems do happen. So some principles is be intentional, enumerate trade-offs, and make informed decisions. Why are we supporting this language right now and not this other language? And stand by them. If everyone's agreed on the criteria for what languages you're supporting, I'll be much more helpful. The next is value-sensitive design. Not the same as the value testing that we just talked about, but values like what are the values that we have at play in why we're launching this language. So, for instance, are we launching this language because we think there's a lot of business opportunity for people in that language? Or maybe you think of like a dialect where the numbers will be different than the main language. Or are we launching this language because we want to help digitally disadvantaged languages? And that's the reason. So even if we're not going to get 1 million people using this, there's still like good reasons in order to launch this anyway. And so making sure to be upfront with why are we making these decisions and what are the values at play, because you can't it can be very hard to compare two things if the value judgments are completely different in the two different statements. Because if one person is worried about what is the revenue of this locale and one person is worried about how can we help people, that conversation, you cannot reconcile it. And so you have to be upfront about the values and make sure that everyone's agreeing on both of these values make sense and we want to do both. And also just writing your plan down. Sometimes you're so busy doing this plan that you forget to write it down and you're like, oh, wait, a year later, you're like, what did I do? How do I do this for the next language? I don't know. So just writing it down could be really useful. So as an engineer, I love tools because I want to build things and I'm a very visual person. So the next strategy in order to expand to so many languages is to have the right tooling. So I'll talk about two different tools that I've worked on. So one is the locale details tool. So this was a way for us to understand what was actually happening underneath the hood. So for instance, in the top screenshot, you see this is like the decomposition of locale tags for, and this is for ESLA. So Facebook, when they started working on what languages we were supporting, had a very rigid structure that we could only support 5-character locale codes. Yes, I regret my predecessors making that decision, but that is the decision and we have to live with it because all of our Spanish translations are now labeled as ESLA. And we will launch a product and we will launch a new locale selector. And now suddenly we will show that we support Spanish in Laos. And we're like, no. LA means Latin America for this specific case. So I don't recommend anyone else making this mistake. Please use ES419 for all Latin America and Spanish. However, we need to make sure that we know this more than just in the INTN team. But when people are leveraging language support, they can figure out, oh, in this case, LA is not the actual, it's not the proper ISO code for Spanish and Latin America. And then another example is the number configuration. So one of the unfun feedbacks we got when we were launching Central Kurdish, also known as Sorani Kurdish, was, so Sorani Kurdish uses in CLDR, uses the Arabic numerals for their numbers. And the feedback we got is they preferred Latin numerals instead. And we're like, what? Because that's not what we expected. And so we still have to work on that. Like this is because we know some end users will prefer one way and some will the other. This is not the only community that uses the Arabic script for words, but Latin numbers for numbers. So for instance, Morocco, that's very common. But we didn't anticipate this in Iraq, where they speak Sorani Kurdish. And so this is, so we made sure to also showcase, like this is the expected number formatting, and then asked the linguist, instead of assuming that everything from CLDR was exactly what the linguist expected, we asked our linguist, hey, can you verify that this is how numbers are formatted for your language? And this is something that we'll be going to when we're revising, like, I definitely want to say like CLDR is meant to be a living repository of information. And so this is something that we'll be working through to try to make sure that CLDR represents the best information for each language. Another tool that I worked on is this thing called locale sets. I'm not enamored by the name, but it's the best name that we could have. So Meta supports over 200 different products and features within products. Think of like dating in Facebook. The language that we support for dating is not going to be the same as the main languages that we support for Facebook, just because dating will not work in many linguistic and cultural communities, at least internet dating. And so like we have to treat these products differently, and they'll each support a different set of languages or locales. And it got really confusing on which app was actually supporting what. And people would make assumptions and ask for translations, and we're like, no end users are going to see those translations. And it was important to make a tool where people could find out, like, oh, this is what we actually support here, and making it clear, like the support clear. It's also important to have an historical record of these decisions as well. Like, why aren't we supporting this language yet? Is there a good reason or is there a bad reason? And maybe this is a reason that we can revisit in the future. Or maybe it's like, oh, the language never worked out when we launched it the first time, so maybe we shouldn't launch it. We shouldn't try again. And then another really strong part of this tool is it's editable by anyone on our INTnet team. So it's not just the engineer that can modify the configuration files, but my partners in language program management and language management, they can also make changes to this and add information here. So they don't, because like the worst thing is when they ask for an engineer to do something, the engineer has no context into this localization behavior, and then it just never gets done. But if I can empower our cross-functional partners to make the changes that they need themselves, then this saves my time and it gives the decisions to the actual people that know it the most. So some principles in this is transparency. There's the metaphor of the black box, where you have an input and goes into a black box and you get the outputs. Tear open that black box. Don't hide how your system's working. Visualizing complex interactions can be really important. And I learned so much about number formatting by just saying how does our system actually think it should support numbers? And so we adding that transparency has helped us understand exactly what our system is and get us the feedback that we need in order to localize correctly. As mentioned, grant control. Your cross-functional partners are strategic partners. Some of our companies are would put decisions in the engineer's hands. I don't like that. I don't speak these languages. I want to put decisions in the hands of the people that actually speak these languages and work in these markets. And so the more I can do that, the better we are and the best product that we can provide. And an interesting trade-off is operational efficiency. So a lot of the reason why we're doing this tool in the first place is that we want to improve our OpEx. We want to do things faster and better. When sometimes this time we're spent building that tool is actually not the time that's making us more efficient. And so that's a trade-off that we always need to be aware of. Whereas it sounds like we want it, but maybe there's not the return on investment that we thought. However, I will say like one return of investment that is like there's two main ways. One is you've empowered someone else to do it, and so you don't need to do it themselves, and so everyone was able to save time. And the other investment is you know exactly what your system's doing. So instead of having a problem where you're trying to debug something, you're taking no one knows how to debug the system. Saving that time is also something that the tools can provide you. And then lastly, user-centered design. One of the worst parts is that I was building something for our language managers, and I went to our French language manager. I was like, "Hey, how does this look? Does this like do what you want?" And he's like, "I have no idea what you're trying to do." And the conversation ended up being something completely unrelated to what I was doing. It's like, oh man, why did I spend all this time building something if it wasn't what the language manager actually wanted? And so keeping the users in the loop, like I knew that, but I just need to constantly remind myself, because as the engineer, I know what my system is doing in a good day. And I need to make sure that I'm not assuming that end users, the other users, especially people that aren't engineers, are also able to understand it. And then the last strategy is automation. So when possible, I love to add a button to do something that someone wants to do, as opposed to them coming to me and asking to do it themselves. Too often, the way that we do something is you ask an engineer to run a script. And I was like, can't I just give a button? And then the script runs for them. And so whenever I find an opportunity to do that, I get so happy. Because then we never have to worry about that again. Famous last words. Other things, as I mentioned before, having test coverage. Using tests to both show what the expected functionality is. And so tests will alert you if you've made a change that will affect end users. But also fail fast. Don't find out because someone was able to translate a bug report from someone that speaks full day, and then like you go through so many steps and you finally get to an engineer that can fix the problem. It's going to take too much time, or we're never actually going to fix the problem. But if you have proper test coverage, then you can realize, oh wait, this is a problem. Then lastly, using if this then that rules. The difference, we have a system called Butterfly. There are other systems at play where maybe an engineer doesn't need to actually implement the automation themselves. Maybe it's something that that a cross-functional partner can do. So as a principle here, don't repeat yourself, which is kind of funny because I'm also like, write all the documentation. But also, something I like to do is we have like a Q&A where people ask us questions in the INTN team. When someone asks me the first time, I'm like, okay, this is I write out the answer. When someone asks me the second time, I'm like, I'm not writing this again. I try to find ways to save myself time, so I'm not just doing it over time and time again. And similar to tooling, make sure you only automate things that will scale. The time spent doing the automation, is that time actually saved? And avoid complex dependencies. We've had ideas to automate things, but then we've had to update the automation because like, oh, this constraint happened, or oh, like this country has a specific rule, and then suddenly this automation is no longer actually saving us time. 5 minutes. Okay, we're gonna burn through the CLDR. Okay, so these are the 4 strategies again. Let's talk about CLDR. We have 5 items, 5 minutes. Let's do it. 10 minutes. Okay, we have 5 items, 2 minutes. Okay. Something that's nice about using CLDR is that this entire room has worked on it and or will work on it. We don't have to, it's not me, an engineer in Seattle, making a decision for every single language, but it's a committee of people that have voted on things that we can all benefit. However, CLDR doesn't always work for our use cases, and we need to make sure we're making the right decisions. So here's some things that I learned trying to use the CLDR. So CLDR stands for the Common Locale Data Repository, and it's a list of both translations, but also things like how we format numbers. So lesson number 1. So the desire. We can automatically update it, right? CLDR has gone from like version 41 to 42. We can just automatically update everything and then not have to worry about it. Oh, it's I wish it was that easy, and I bet everyone in CLDR wishes too. But in the reality, it doesn't always work that way. So let's look at French. So when we're translating French, if you say 0 comments or 1 comment of something, you use the same plural form. So you would actually say like effectively 0 comment. And then you have the other plural form, which is like 2 comments, 3 comments, and so forth. And so like the French plural rules are slightly different than in English. And so cool, CLDR tells us there's 2 plural cases for French. And then wait, now there's another plural case. And so now we have to issue a 3rd translation every time we write French. And also, I'm realizing after the message format talk this morning that basically we should also always write a 0 translation as well. Like this, suddenly what became 2 plural cases has become 3, maybe 4. And so this, but we've already translated French. We have this library of translations, tens of thousands of translations that depend on the plural rules that we had in 2019. And now in 2020, we have to go back and retranslate those. And so you have to be very careful when making these updates. Like, do we now have to go back? Because if the rule of sometimes in our system is if we don't have a translation, just give them English. But now suddenly we'll be regressing. And so we want to make sure that we can be ahead of this. Another desire that I love. So this is probably the most important slide for all of us. I wish this wasn't true, but it is. So if we translate it, people will switch to that language, right? It's going to benefit everyone. And like, I want to translate every single language in the world. Like, you know the meme where there's the woman that's like, she loves cats and she wants to hug them all, but she can't and it makes her sad. That's like me with languages. Like, I wish we could translate them all and have everything in the most localized content possible. And so like on one hand, you'll have global languages like English, French, or Standard Arabic. But then there'll also be local languages like Bhojpuri, Kirundi, and Lebanese Arabic. So do you think if we translate them, everyone's going to suddenly switch their UI to the new language? Unfortunately, that's not what people necessarily want from your service. While Facebook wants to be a local company, it wants to meet people where they are. if the business software, maybe people prefer using those global languages. The translated into the local language is not actually what they want. Whereas when people are talking to each other, telling stories and talking to their community, they'll use the local languages, but that's not reflected on the actual platform that you're building. And there's a whole continuum here of people preferring global languages versus the local ones. There's lots of reasons why people do this, and so like we were working on like trying to, how do we educate end users to adopt these languages? And sometimes they're like, no, I'm happy using English, and I'm like, but we just translated your language. But you have to meet people where they want it, because they like for our company, they do, like, you're an American company, you're not local to us. We'd rather just have your interface in English. And so so sometimes it's not just if you build it, they will come. It doesn't always work like that. And so similarly, can I use the territory information in CLDR as a ground truth on which languages we should support? So for instance, here we have these population counts and like what percent of people in a country use a language. Like down here, you see AE, which is the United Arab Emirates, 78% of people speak Arabic in the country. This data is not actually something that we can always use to motivate what languages we support in which countries. So this is a map of the Anglophone and Francophone worlds, according to CLDR and according to our data. So in the darker red and darker blue, you see the Anglophone and Francophone world based on just in CLDR, the top language that's spoken by the most amount of people is English and French. So we see the usual suspects like Ireland, Australia, Ivory Coast. The top language in those countries is English and French. However, in the lighter colors, in the pink and in the lighter blue, you can see these countries are actual countries where we see the majority of people are actually using the interface in English or French, including Saudi Arabia. Now, part of that could be our own problems and things that we have to fix, with like right to left bugs. But why do so many people in Saudi Arabia preferring English over Arabic, which is just really surprising. And then at the other side of the Arabic world, we have Morocco and Algeria, where French is more popular, even when we support Arabic. And so it makes it harder to prioritize the right languages, and the CLDR data is not necessarily giving us the information that predicts what internet usage will be. Another thing you see here is that India is the biggest English-speaking country in the world. That still, the majority of users in India prefer using our platform in English, even when we translate into their language. And again, just like I said before, there are reasons why. And of course, Facebook is one application. Your application will have different, people will have different opinions, and so maybe this won't hold true for yours. But it's something that we have to realize. And when we write English content, we're not writing to just Americans. We're writing to the biggest country that's reading the English content are people in India. Lesson number 4. Oh man, I have like 1 minute for these 2 lessons. There's regional locale variance in CLDR. Perfect. We can just give all that option, right? All that data is perfectly vetted and complete, right? So for instance, in Spanish Mexico, they use 1.5, like the period symbol for decimals, but in most other Spanish-speaking countries, they use a comma. Or if someone's using Bengali, they want to use Bengali numerals, right? That's not actually how it works out, though. Bengali readers in Bangladesh do want to use Bengali numerals, but they want to use Latin numerals in India. And then on the other hand, the Spanish Puerto Rico and Spanish US, they should be using the same formatting as ESMX, not the same formatting as ESAR. And the data is not trying to give you the certainty, because it's just defaulting. But if you don't realize that it's not always completely covered, then it'll give you a certainty that you shouldn't have. And then the last lesson here is, should we translate every single word? Like there's lots of words that are listed in CLDR. Can we use that to bootstrap our translations? But not every word is meant to be translated. So for instance, one of my colleagues working on this, she's from Kazakhstan. And so when we were telling Kazakh users like, hey, the Facebook app is translated in Kazakh, we would translate that, the phrase Facebook app as Facebook Koldam Basi. And she was like, what did you just say? Like she didn't even know that word. Because like the translation for the word app, that is the chosen translation in the Kazakh dictionary. But that actually means but that doesn't really work in context, and it's only a recent invention. And so she didn't even recognize that word. Like, what are we trying to say? And so sometimes we transliterate, and she's like, no, don't do that in this case. In other examples, maybe you should like use the Cyrillic characters, but she's like, no, that's worse. Don't do that. And she's like, why don't you just say Facebook? Maybe that's not as precise in the translation, but it's important to make sure we're not over translating things. And then the last interesting story here is when we were translating Shona, our linguist for Shona was like, we asked, oh, can you translate the month names? And she was like, no. Like because the idea of entering your birthday into a system is not something that she's used to in her community. And so when she, if we're asking to enter her birthdays, like that's something that they do in school in English. And so for her, it was better to show month names untranslated. And that just like made us like broke our minds a little bit because we're like, but we'd love to translate everything into as local content as possible. And she's like, yeah, but the way it works in your interface, it's not as necessarily that local. We ended up talking with other linguists, and there were some differing opinions on this, which is a good reason why we have voting mechanisms for CLDR. But it definitely was a lesson to learn. So these are the lessons, and there definitely are solutions. Always ask a native speaker. I don't speak these languages. I need to trust the people that do, and ask additional people if we have disagreement. Contribute back to CLDR. CLDR is waiting for your feedback. That's something that there's a lot of tickets that I can file that I haven't filed yet, and something that we can do to make sure that CLDR is more effective. And also, I didn't even really touch on it, but use the ICU library. Then the less proprietary translation technology you have, and the more we can use ICU and ICU4X, the better that it can fall into national standards, and you're not on the hook if things go well or they don't. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Conrad. That was a great presentation. I've got lots of questions, but unfortunately there's not time for questions. But there is time for cookies, and we can find Conrad and ask all our questions anytime this afternoon. So thank you again. Let's give another big round of applause.